Ever since I was a kid, I have always been a magnet of bad luck for the people around me. My parents cursed me for it, and my friends mocked me because of it. No matter where I went, I just always seemed to be present in the place where bad things happened. To make good use of this damn curse, I became an officer of the law. During my early days, there was this very peculiar case that was given to me which ended up getting closed without any solid results. A number of unnatural deaths were reported in the area where I was assigned to, and I happened to be the perfect guy for the case because of my gift of being in the right place at the right time. Even though the cases remained unsolved, I was there to witness some of the unusual deaths of the victims on the list. However, what I found out was not something that I could disclose to anyone. The cause of their untimely passing was beyond logic and reasoning. I wouldn't even call them victims since no crime was committed. I didn't know how to conclude the cases when I found out that the cause of their deaths were simply Death himself fooling around to kill some time. When I went to the location to conduct my investigation, there was a man amidst the crowd of people that I found quite suspicious. He was wearing a black jacket over his black suit during the summer season. His eyes were hidden behind his shades, and he had this suspicious grin on his face despite of the dead body getting carried out from a hotel at the city. According to the initial report, he was found dead in his room with a mouthful of greasy steak stuffed in his mouth while a pornographic video was playing in the background. It was one of those bizarre kinks which the subject had an unhealthy appetite for meat whenever he was aroused. Apparently, he was about to climax when he tried to swallow a huge slab of meat and choked to death because of it. There was no trace of foul play whatsoever, but in the next case that I went to, I saw the same suspicious man once again. 2 days after the previous case, another weird death was reported. The body was found in his condo unit. His skull was splattered, his ribs were all broken, and his limbs were twisted as if he had fallen from a very great height. The autopsy report backed up this conclusion, but it didn't make sense at all. The person was seen entering his unit, and there were video records in the security cams to support this statement. Nobody else was spotted entering his room, and there should have been traces in his body if ever he was murdered with a blunt object for his bones to be in such a debilitated state. As I was keenly inspecting the room for any evidence of a possible crime, I looked out the window and saw the mysterious man in a black suit staring at me from across the street. I immediately rushed out of the building and followed him to see if he had anything to do with these consecutive cases of unusual deaths. I was able to corner him inside an alleyway, but his answer to my question was something that I never expected to hear. I pinned him against the wall and asked why he was always around during our investigations. With a confident look on his face, he told me that these men were grateful to die in such a manner. He casually shared the identity of the man who died in the condo, and he knew too much about him. He said that he was an extreme mountain climber who climbed death-defying heights without any safety equipment. He was expected to eventually die by falling, and so he did regardless of the time and place that it happened. After telling this information, the suspicious man began to laugh. His unethically dark humor was both disturbing and surreal. He spilled this information as if he knew exactly what happened to him, but I could not figure out how he did it. Without any effort, the man turned around to face me while I was putting all my weight against his back to pin him on the wall. I told him not to resist, and he said he wasn't resisting at all. I unholstered my gun and held it up as a warning since he was already a suspect at that point, but the mysterious man just smirked and said that he wasn't going anywhere. He told me that he found me quite intriguing, and the reason why had left me confused and speechless. He casually talked about my past, and that I was often around when something bad happens ever since I was a child. He said that I would have witnessed those deaths if they happened in a public place because I was always in the right place at the right time. I aggressively tried to push him back on the wall out of panic, but he didn't even budge from where he stood. I asked him how he knew about me, and his response would have been quite laughable if not for what he did next. The man casually introduced himself to me as Death, as if he was telling me a normal job. I tried my best to practice my authority as an officer of the law, but I was as helpless as a feeble child when he lifted me by the neck and pushed me against the wall with a single hand. He removed his shades and revealed his eyes, which baffled me even further. His eyes had a color of gold, and it reflected light in the same way that a refined precious metal would. I pointed my gun right on his forehead, but he just dared me to pull the trigger without any trace of fear nor hesitation. When he put me back down, he said that he could easily prove his identity if I tag along with him, and so I did. Despite of his ludicrous knowledge about me and the death of the previous subject, I still couldn't figure out how he was able to crush a man's bones as if he had fallen from a great height. He was abnormally strong, and the color of his eyes were unnatural. However, these irregularities wouldn't put him above the law. If ever he would do any crime in my presence, I would be there to arrest him along with a backup. We walked into a diner and sat on a table right in front of a man in his late 20s. Just like before, he shared some detailed information about this person as if he personally knew him. He said that the man was a free diver who achieved remarkable records and he was expected to die in that field. The mysterious man turned his head to me and told me to watch closely. He hanged his coat at the back of his chair, and I didn't see anything bulking under his clothes which could indicate a concealed weapon. He had nothing with him that could threaten this man's well-being, but what happened next sent jitters down my spine. The man was quietly having a meal with his eyes locked on the screen of his phone. He took a sip of water, and this mysterious man who claimed himself as the Death himself only flicked a finger while grinning. All of a sudden, this person started choking. He repeatedly slammed his chest with his fist until he completely lost his composure and desperately tried to gasp for air. The crew of the establishment tried to help him until he started to vomit water. The amount of water coming from him astounded everyone in the diner. Everything in his table got wet as if he was spewing gallons. The water coming from him was crawling on the feet of the other customers, and everybody was freaking out. I did not know how he was doing it, but I knew that it was him. I held my gun right against his temple and ordered him to stop, but he just looked at me at the corner of his eyes and said that humans couldn't stop death. He asked me how he was doing it if he wasn't who he claimed to be, and I had no answer to this question. There was nothing else I could do, and so I fired my gun in an attempt to save the man in front of us. As I was questioning myself if my action was justified, the mysterious man just pulled his head back from the recoil and fixed his hair. I was sitting right next to him, and I pulled the trigger point blank right against his head, and yet, he was still alive. Somebody called for emergency while the others ran off the establishment, especially since I fired my gun. The man in front of us was completely helpless. His eyes went red, and he was turning purplish pale with each passing second. His face and belly started to swell as he kept on puking profusely like a loosened pump. Few minutes later, he collapsed on the floor. With a single sip of water, he died by drowning. I was sickened and in disbelief by what I just witnessed, and this mysterious stranger sitting next to me was enjoying my spooked expression with a smug look on his face. I was sweating profusely as we walked out of the establishment. As an officer of the law, I felt completely powerless and incompetent while a man died right in front of me. When the other officers came, I told them what happened, but I didn't tell them about the man that was responsible for it. I recognized his strength, and I just discovered that he couldn't be killed. He did not do anything that could classify as evident proof of foul play. All I saw was a flick of a finger, and I shot him for it. When the initial report was filed, the man who claimed himself as Death appeared again and invited me to come with him. He went on a carnival show, and we stood in front of a performer having his break. Death told me that this man was a fire breather, and he also told me that he was abusing his wife and daughter. I couldn't tell if he was telling the truth. Eventually, I realized that I was just there to witness another unnatural death. I couldn't understand it, and I couldn't stop it. He casually walked towards the man. All he did was touch the end of his sleeve with the tip of his finger, and he was suddenly engulfed in flames. The fire came from within him. As he breathed out smoke, the fire broke out from his chest and crawled into his clothes. It caused a commotion in the carnival, and people started to spill buckets of water to put out the fire. But he was beyond helpless. He was probably already dead before he burnt his skin. His entire body was swallowed by flames within seconds, and he was reduced to cinders. Once again, I was there to witness a tragic event. It felt unusual that I was walking along Death himself, but at the same time, it didn't feel like I was out of place since these things were happening in my presence for as long as I can remember. In some ways, I felt familiar with Death. I just didn't expect that I would actually meet him in a personified form. Before I knew it, I was already believing him. We fled from the scene before my colleagues arrived. If I was in both areas of the tragedies at the same day, they would also start to suspect me. We walked around until we reached the theater. At the lounge, we saw the main actress of the show sitting at the bar. She was oozing with confidence as she talked to the men around her, but it was easy to tell that she had undergone a number of plastic surgeries to hide her aging appearance. Once again, Death casually walked towards her, and I was left on the corner to watch what would happen. She was speaking amongst the other actresses as if they were discussing the latest laser surgeries and the questionable brands of self-acclaimed medical breakthrough for anti-aging. Death came in like a gentleman. He softly brushed the back of his fingers across her cheek as he was complimenting her beauty, and all of her efforts went down the drain in the worst way she could possibly imagine. The woman who acquired all that science and technology could offer to stop her aging suddenly aged 100 times over. From the gentle graze on her cheek, her skin crumpled and rapidly deteriorated in a blink of an eye. Her joints gave out and she fell on her knees like a puppet that lost her strings. Her hair turned white and fell on her lap as her voice turned coarse. When she tilted her head and grabbed the strands of her hair, the last thing she saw before she lost her sight was her bony hand losing its strength as her muscles withered. Her flesh rotted until all that remained were her bones on the floor. The people in the lounge screamed in terror as we stood in front of her remains. I could no longer question the mysterious man's identity after seeing different ways of death in a single day. Instead, I began to question the value of time people waste on the things they do. I wondered if their untimely deaths were justified, but a mere human could not question death himself. I reported the third incident on my own since there was no way they could blame this one on me. After that day, I would see him from time to time, but I chose to distance myself and not get too involved. Perhaps it was in my nature to be present in these tragedies just as much as the nature of death himself.